Well, I'll just explain a few housekeeping items before we begin, but let me first start by welcoming all of you. I didn't have the opportunity to welcome the 12 of you online like I usually did. Thanks, Stan, for just taking over. I'm glad, though, that we'll be able to have Debra Dean Murphy presenting to us today. Before I introduce her, though, I'll note that there are continuing education units available, and so please stick around at the end of the broadcast, and I'll be able to give you a link to a form to fill out to request CEUs if you would like to obtain those, as well as to remind you, as you can see on your screen, that Deborah will be with us again in 1 week to continue this series, bringing us missional worship and the Lord's table. Today, of course, is missional worship and congregational formation. So, without further ado, let me introduce our speaker for today. Debra Dean Murphy is Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at West Virginia Wesleyan College and the author of Teaching That Transforms: Worship as the Heart of Christian Education. She is active in the Ecclesia Project, a network of Christians and Christian communities from across the theological and denominational spectrum, and she blogs at Intersections, Thoughts on Religion, Politics, and Culture. Deborah recently converted from United Methodism to the Roman Catholic Church. And so, Deborah, I'd like to welcome you. I'd invite you to restart your mic and start your camera, and we'll try to make sure everything's working for you.
Okay, I think I'm here.
We see you and hear you, so you're all set.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Ensign. And I'm a very low-tech theologian trying to do a very high-tech project here, so thank you for all your help and for bearing with me. I also want to thank Stan for the invitation to do this webinar. It's been wonderful to work with him through the months and plan this event. And I'm grateful for the presence of all the participants here today, whom I cannot see. And that is strange to me, but I know you're there. And I do want to say that this topic of missional worship and congregational formation, I don't presume that I'm going to say anything earth-shatteringly new. I think that maybe I've arranged or rearranged some topics and ideas in ways that might be fruitful for some conversation for all of us. And I also want to say that I'm grateful to be able to think about these matters in a new context for me, the Church of the Brethren, and so I'm eager to learn myself through this event. So thanks to all of you, to Enton, to Stan, and to all the participants who are here today. Our working title is Missional Worship and Congregational Formation. And for today's webinar, I've kind of tracked my remarks through 3 questions. I've also got some PowerPoint here that will sort of help us with those questions. They are, just to remind us all, how does missional worship form a people and not just persons? How is missional worship like therapy? Maybe that's an odd, counterintuitive idea that we'll explore a little bit. And how is missional worship like doing the dishes? I also think, even before I begin with the first question and with my first PowerPoint slide, it's helpful to unpack those terms a little. Missional, especially, it's a new word, at least in our generation, I think, and it's got lots of associations and connotations. So let me just say a couple of things about how I'm thinking about it here and ways we might think about missional worship. So here's a slide that might be helpful. The biblical idea, of course, is not that God's church has a mission, but that God's mission has a church. And Jürgen Moltmann has a very succinct and helpful way of putting it, I think. He says, "It is not the church that has a mission of salvation to fulfill in the world. It is the mission of the Son and the Spirit through the Father that includes the church." And we know that Scripture names and narrates, and the church professes that this Missio Dei is the work of healing and of restoration, of forgiveness and reconciliation, of welcome, hospitality, shalom, fullness of life, the flourishing of all of creation. I think those are the ways we can characterize biblically and confessionally the Missio Dei. And so the church's primary task is not self-preservation or even renewal of its own inner life. The church's fundamental work is to bear witness to God's mission in the world and to discern and to participate in that pressing, holy, joyful work wherever it's encountered. So worship, or missional worship. I think we would say then that missional worship proclaims and celebrates what God has done, is doing, and will do in and through Jesus. And at its best, I think missional worship draws on the rich resources of historic Christian liturgy, even as it seeks to offer praise and thanksgiving in the varied context of the church's life and witness. And missional worship, I think, recognizes the call to false worship all around us, the many calls to false worship. We're going to talk about some of these. The lure of power, political power, militarism, the market, personal status and prestige, the American dream, these other ways we're invited to enact our loyalties. And also, and finally, just in terms of breaking down these terms a little, I think that missional worship is, in some sense, circular. Worship, we know, sends us out into the world, the liturgy after the liturgy, as the Orthodox like to say. But it's also that worship is the primary goal of the Missio Dei. God's desire is to be in communion with all that God has made. We were created for worship. And in Augustine's famous and beloved phrase, our hearts are restless till they find rest in God. So maybe those ways of unpacking missional and missional worship are a little helpful as we begin. So this first part, worship forms a people and not just persons. I have a snippet of a scriptural verse there, Revelation chapter 5, verse 9, and they sang a new song. And you probably know that little verse is embedded in an elaborate, dramatic vision of celestial worship. And I think this is really what the book of Revelation is about, liturgy. And that's a reminder, and this little verse and this longer passage, they're a reminder that from beginning to end, from Genesis to Revelation, God calls and forms and transforms a people. And God desires communion with those people. And this long extended passage from Revelation, which this little verse comes from, has this vivid, visceral description of what this heavenly worship, this celestial liturgy enacts. And these words will be familiar. They will hunger no more and thirst no more. The Lamb, who is also the shepherd, will guide them to springs of the water of life, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. And that is Revelation chapter 7. So this very vivid, visceral description of worship is a vivid, visceral description of healing, restoration, welcome, hospitality, shalom, fullness of life, the flourishing of all. It's the consummated reign of God, the mission of God. So just again to let Scripture sort of center our thoughts on this. And then these 3 points that the slide shows you that Christian worship shapes the social body. Let's begin there. Of course, we do worship as persons. We bring our individual selves to worship. But again, the biblical vision, the biblical truth, from beginning to end, is that God calls and forms and fashions a people through Abraham, through Jesus, through the ecclesia, the called out, gathered, set apart people of God, born of the Spirit on Pentecost. And so the biblical story from beginning to end is shot through with these images and these stories of a pilgrim people making their way toward their true home, the triune God, whose image they bear, and who calls forth in this pilgrim people the praise, adoration, thanksgiving that they were created to offer. Also, staying grounded in Scripture here, St. Paul, of course, uses the metaphor of a social body, many members, one organism. The integrity of each member is honored, but no member can live, can thrive, can do what it is designed to do, apart from the whole, apart from the body. The church described in the Acts of the Apostles a social body, a body politic, if you will, an alternative ordering of human relations, a radically different ordering of human relations. We know this from the record of Acts: no private property, no inherited wealth, all things held in common, the redistribution of goods. You can't really get any more social than that, and we see, of course, the economic implications of this social, radically political, we could say, body. The socially enacted forms and norms of the first 3 centuries of the church's life and its worship continued to bear witness to this different way of being, a way that showed forth the mission of God in the midst of an increasingly hostile empire. We could talk about the Constantinian shift that in many ways stifled and thwarted and snuffed out the church's missional witness. We could talk about the European Enlightenment as a force that radically undercut the church's self-understanding as a social body. But we won't talk about those things because we don't have time. And you know these things. I know you know. But this notion of the church as a social body, the reality of the church as a social body, and of worship as the primary site at which the social body is shaped. Indeed, we might even say the site at which the body of Christ is called into being. They sang a new song. So this is the scriptural truth of our lives as Christ's body, that in and through time, in and through prayer and praise, song and sacrament, silence and speech, the called out people of God in act, participate in, and bear witness to God's mission in the world. This mission to heal and restore, to forgive and reconcile, to welcome and to work for the fullness of all and the flourishing of all. So, worship is not about energizing or rejuvenating or informing individuals, though we may, as individuals, be energized or rejuvenated or informed by the worship we offer. Worship is not for the edification of one's soul, though again, we may, in a real sense, be edified. But rather, worship creates and shapes a social body that participates in and makes known God's mission in the world. How does it do this? One of the ways we could answer that question is to consider how missional worship counters, challenges, confronts other kinds of formation, especially other public liturgies that would seek to form and fashion a people. And here I'll just direct you to number 2 on the PowerPoint screen. And by other public liturgies, I simply mean the ways that we ritually enact loyalties to other gods or other powers that would seek to name and claim us. I have a sign on my office door from David Dark's book, The Sacredness of Questioning Everything, and it goes like this. We might be better equipped to know what's going on if we stop bracketing religion as an entity unrelated and somehow divorced from our everyday choices. We could recognize that a Mercedes commercial, for example, is a call to worship. And so the idea here that the story of the American dream functions something like sacred scripture, a script for performing our lives, a story we live by. And shopping and consumerism generally, and the acquisition of all manner of things, status, prestige, are the practices, the rituals that shape identity and give meaning in that particular narrative. Or we could think about public liturgies around civil religion, patriotism, American exceptionalism, war. I mean, I think more than 10 years of America being continuously involved in war has shown us all sorts of ceremonial, publicly liturgical ways that we enact our loyalty to the nation state. We could also talk about public liturgies that have to do with sports and entertainment, celebrity. We could talk about the cult of the radical individual, the rugged individual, the self-made man or woman, the successful man or woman, all of these ways that these stories, these scripts are sort of enacted in sort of public liturgical forms. Missional worship, by contrast, worship that gives glory to the triune God alone, this worship counters and confronts those other public liturgies and reconfigures, as we know, our loyalties, reshapes our identity. And we'll say more about this in a few minutes when we talk about worship as therapy, but this leads us to this third aspect of the idea that worship forms a people and not just persons, that missional worship immerses us into a lifetime of habit-forming practices that embody and bear witness to the mission of God. And number 3 on the screen there. And to get at this idea of habit-forming practices, and we're going to talk more about worship as habit again in just a minute, but here we can look briefly at 2 foundational, maybe the foundational practices that involve and engender a number of ways that the social body known as the church participates in and bears witness to the mission of God. So baptism and Lord's Supper. In the first, this rite of initiation that brings us into the social body, we undergo an act of disaffiliation. Disaffiliation from, say, rugged individualism or from the self-made woman. Baptism confers an identity at odds with many of the ways we are named and claimed by family, nation, ideology. Names like citizen, consumer, patriot, warrior. Baptism, we know, is a dying and rising with Christ so that we might be made part of a people who forgive instead of retaliate, who are hospitable instead of miserly and suspicious, who assume fullness and abundance, not meagerness and scarcity, who practice peaceableness in the midst of hostility and strife. And I think here in baptism we see so clearly how worship in fact does create and shape a social body, because none of these signs of God's mission, these forms of embodied witness of the Missio Dei, can be practiced or even conceived of as individual acts or personal achievements. And likewise, in the Lord's Supper, this central act of Christian community, foundational for, I think we can say, constitutive of the church's identity, The Lord's Supper, Eucharist, Holy Communion, not so much a thing, but rather something the church does, an act, the prime act, we might say, that enables the church to be. Eucharist is about the ways we are to be with each other. It is about the life we share in God, who is true Holy Communion. Again, the Eucharist reflective of God's own being as a community of persons. In this ritual meal, we share in the life of God, this pattern of relations known as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, the ceaseless caritas, this holy communion of divine love. And also, I think thinking about the Eucharist as paradigm is helpful here. A paradigm as a holistic pattern by which we order our understanding of things. We know about paradigm shifts. We know about the radical paradigm shift of going from a geocentric view of the universe to a heliocentric one. But it was a tremendous shift in thinking, in patterns of behavior and thinking. So the Eucharist is that kind of life-altering way of interpreting and ordering our understanding of things. So the Eucharist is a paradigm through which Christians interpret the church and the world. It shows forth a pattern by which the church is called to order its common life, a pattern marked by habits like generosity, gratitude, hospitality, patterns, practices like the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control, these ways of being. Again, patterns that bear witness to the mission of God in the world. As subversive paradigm, and I think we can talk about the Eucharist as subversive in that way, as a paradigm that subverts the natural order of things or the normal way of viewing things. The Eucharist is practiced in the midst of other liturgies, just what we were talking about a minute ago. Other deeply formative ritual actions like pledging allegiance to the flag or shopping till we drop. Other ways we, again, enact in very public ways our loyalties to other gods. If the liturgies of the nation state, ceremonies, rituals, parades, are about self-preservation through war and violence, the liturgy of the table is one of self-giving and the way of peace. If the liturgies of the market are about competition and hoarding and self-interest, the liturgy of the table is one of radical sharing and a relentless pursuit of the well-being of others. Eucharist, I think we say here, is an imaginative, strategic negation of the power structures everywhere taken for granted. Powers that prize profitability above human flourishing, that seek to render invisible the poor and dispossessed, that place all hope in the unchecked advances of wealth and stigmatize simplicity and frugality, that desecrate the natural world in the name of progress and free enterprise. As the embodied proclamation of the gospel, the Eucharist turns secular power on its head. Blessed are the poor in spirit, the invitation to the banquet reads. And those who mourn, the meek, and those who hunger for righteousness, the merciful, the pure in heart, the peacemakers. That's the mission of God. And so Eucharist, as another way we enact that, we embody it, we participate in it, we bear witness to it, we are formed by it. And next week we talk a lot about the Eucharist, but for now, for here, to see Eucharist along with baptism as these foundational ways that we're immersed in practices that bear witness to the Missio Dei. So let me shift and shift my slide to this second set of themes driven by the second question, that missional worship is like therapy, that it's lifelong detox for our distorted desires. In these remarks here, I'm going to be drawing a lot on the work of James Allison, a favorite theologian of mine, British Roman Catholic. The piece that's most informed my thinking about these matters is an essay of his called Worship in a Violent World. It's found in his book, Undergoing God. So this idea of missional worship being like therapy. One of the kind of startling things that Allison says in that essay, and I do believe it's startling. I remember the first time I read it, I resisted it. I was thinking, I don't know about this. And I think maybe if you're hearing this for the first time, it'll raise maybe those kinds of questions for you, and we can talk more about that at the end if this indeed does kind of raise those concerns for you. But one of the things he says that's just sort of straight out stark and startling, I think, is that God has no desire for us to worship him for his sake. True worship is for our own good, no one else's. And again, counterintuitive maybe, going against much of what we've heard and some of the lingo we use about it not being about us, that kind of thing. But we will talk about those things if those seem pressing. But stick with me and let me try to unpack a little bit of this provocative idea. We give glory to God in worship. We render our praise to God in song and sacrament, prayer and preaching, not because God's ego needs to be flattered or because we need to stave off some divine petulance, but because if we don't offer our worship to the triune God, we will have no protection at all against all other sorts of worship, the sorts of worship that we've already gestured at, the false worship, the idolatries of nationalism, the market, conspicuous consumption. If we don't worship God as we are commanded to do, says Allison, we will allow our hearts to be formed by the desires of the contradictory social other that is around us, and that heart will eventually participate in its own heartbreak and self-destruction. True worship of the true God is for our own good, no one else's. Our learning to give glory to God, to render God praise, is lifelong therapy for distorted desire. We worship that we might be given the sort of desire that will enable us not to be moved by the social other, again, things we've named already as capturing our imagination and requiring our loyalty, but instead empower us as creators of a quite different social other, what we're calling here the Missio Dei. True worship inducts us over time into the process of having our desires, and thus our hearts and our way of being with each other, completely transformed. And Allison has this provocative, apt phrase, I think, when he says that worship is orchestrated detox. It's about getting clean, getting healthy. And if we think about salvation, that foundational word in our theological vocabulary, if we think about the root of that word having to do with health and wellness and well-being, wholeness, I think there are rich associations there, that in worship we get healthy. We get clean. And an associated, I think, insight of Allison's that's helpful here, the idea that worship is not our achievement, that God gathers us, that the Spirit enlivens us, that Jesus comes to us in word and sacrament. We don't make anything happen. Allison says, Christian worship is predicated on the understanding that there is nothing left to achieve. The kingdom has already been inaugurated and obtained. We are participants in a drama not of our own making. We don't have to do liturgy right in order to make something happen. Jesus said he'd be there. Our only task is to habitually make ourselves present as this social body, this worshiping body, to the one who is just there. I think this is really hard for us. I think that our well-meaning tendency is to engineer worship, to manipulate the experience of worshipers, to design liturgy in ways that we think will be meaningful, to attract, compel, dazzle, all of those things. So it's very hard, I think, for us to think about worship in this counterintuitive way. And again, we can talk more about that if that seems to be a pressing question at the end. But worship as therapy, as redirecting our loves, as the proper ordering of our desires, as the detoxification of our pathologies and our addictions. In baptism, we are named and claimed as those who will be set free from false loves, from disordered desires. And it will take our whole lives to live into that reality. Martin Luther has that wonderful phrase that says something like, baptism is a once and for all sacrament that takes your whole life to finish. We'll be in therapy for the rest of our days. We need to die daily. We need to remember our baptism often. And then in the Eucharist, we find our loves, our desires redirected from self outward to neighbor. We find our desires are shaped by God's generous dealings with us and with all. But again, we'll need to be in therapy for the rest of our lives. We need to keep coming to the table of welcome and plenty, that we might be signs of welcome and plenty in the world. And then this last question, set of issues about missional worship. That missional worship is like doing the dishes, work we have been given to do over and over. You have to go to therapy regularly, right? Detox is a process over time. One session with your therapist won't cut it. Formation takes time, and it occurs as particular habits are cultivated and as others are forsaken. No matter what kind of formation we are undergoing, it takes time. And here I think we can talk about the pedagogy of repetition, ritualized repetition, doing the same things over and over. We could think of lots of examples, right? The example of athletics or exercise. You want to train for a marathon. A lot of repetition, ritualized repetition. You want to train your children in good manners. It takes a long time. Lots and lots of ritualized repetition, the pedagogy of repetition. I have a quote on the screen there on the PowerPoint from Kierkegaard, and don't really want to say anything more about that from his perspective or delve too deeply into the context he's using it in, but it's helpful, I think, for what we're about. Repetition is reality, and it is the seriousness of life. Repetition is the daily bread which satisfies with benediction. And I think that insight, that way of putting it by Kierkegaard, suggests a kind of mindfulness in our repetition. Mindfulness, not mindlessness, which is what we often associate with chores, right? Like doing dishes and doing the laundry and liturgy. And again, that's, I think, our enduring challenge. How do we undergo this pedagogy of repetition mindfully? How do we learn to pay attention? How does worship train us in those skills? How do we learn to pay attention to the right things? Kathleen Norris, you may know, has a little book about these matters. It's called The Quotidian Mysteries, Laundry, Liturgy, and Women's Work. And it's here that I got the insight about missional worship being like doing the dishes. Worship, she says, is not unlike doing the wash. It's work we've been given to do, and we must do it over and over. And it's work we've been asked to be present to, mindful of, to be present in those moments. I'm teaching this semester, quite against my will, actually, a course on Hinduism and Buddhism, and I just came from my Hinduism and Buddhism class before we started this webinar, and there's so much, as you probably know, about Buddhism especially, that is about cultivating mindfulness and attentiveness and being present. And it struck me as I was going into that class this afternoon thinking, how am I going to be mindful to my students when I'm preoccupied by this other thing that I need to do this afternoon that is sort of pressing on me and preoccupying me. So the difficulty in all areas of our lives to be truly mindful, to be truly present. And I think there's plenty also in the Christian contemplative tradition that has resources for us in this too that we don't often tap into. But again, this idea of repetitive work that we're asked to be present to, mindful of, so that it can do its transforming work. I think of the rule of St. Benedict, which speaks about the habits that are necessary for living doxologically, which is what we were created to do and to be, doxological creatures. And as you probably know in that classic text, prayer and work and prayer are on a continuum, are of a piece with the holy habits that make us human, that form us as a people of praise and thanksgiving, that make possible for us doxology as a mode of existence, a way of being and living. I'm always struck in that book by St. Benedict that instructions for how to cultivate humility or embrace suffering or tend to the sick are interspersed with directions for the appropriate number of psalms at vigils or the proper decorum for celebrating lauds on Sunday. The habits of worship form and inform the habits of neighborliness and vice versa. This all on a continuum, this all of a piece. And we practice good habits whether we feel like it or not. Right? If you're a runner, a lot of days you don't feel like it. A lot of cold winter days in northern West Virginia, I don't feel like running. The habit of worship, no different, right? Sometimes we just don't plain feel like it. And in a culture that puts such a premium on feelings, that can be a little dangerous. If I don't feel like it, I won't do it. So that also is an enduring challenge of cultivating habits even when it feels like the last thing that we want to do. And another insight from another of Kathleen Norris's works, this is Dakota, a spiritual geography, and one of the things that struck her about this mindful repetition and the formation over the long haul in being attentive to practice and habit. And she says, one of the first things I noticed on my longer retreats when I was with the monks in choir 4 or 5 times a day for a week or more was how like an exercise class the liturgy seemed. It was sometimes difficult to rise early for morning office. At other times during the day it seemed tedious to be going back to church. But knowing that others would be there made all the difference. Once there, the benefits were tangible. and I usually wondered how I could have wished to be anywhere else. When I compared all of this to an aerobics class, a monk said, "That's exactly right." So it's the habit of worship over time, not unlike the habit of athletic training undertaking even when the athlete doesn't feel like it, that shapes us into the people of God who bear witness to the mission of God in the world God has made and that God loves. So let me just try to sum up briefly, and then we can move to the next part, questions, comments, that kind of thing. Missional worship, worship that understands that God is doing a new thing in the world and that we are invited to both partake in it and bear witness to it. This worship assumes the formation over time of a people. Baptism initiates us into the practices of God's way in the world. Eucharist sustains us for that journey and makes us into a social body bearing witness for the sake of the world. Missional worship is therapeutic in the sense that it reorders our desires, treats our pathologies. And finally, missional worship is our work for a lifetime. It must be a habit, or we'll forget who we are. So thank you very much.
Well, Deborah, thank you for sharing such wonderful content with us this afternoon. And as we think about what you have shared with us, we invite people to post their questions or thoughts in the interactive chat. I'm curious, could you share with us what was the process for you as you made that move from the United Methodist Church for your own faith journey into moving into and participating and becoming active with the Catholic Church community? I think that would be helpful for us to understand as well.
Okay. I'm a very new Catholic. I was just received into full communion at the Easter Vigil two Sundays ago, a week and a half ago. But it has been a long process. I think probably beginning in my divinity school years, and maybe even before that, just experiencing liturgy in certain places and in certain contexts and being very much drawn to historic liturgy, reading about it. I mean, that always was a draw and a pull for me. I grew up, I'm a lifelong United Methodist. I worked professionally in a United Methodist Church for almost 7 years as a director of Christian formation. I will say I didn't leave the United Methodist Church angry. I think I have had through the years a lot of anger or frustration at much of Methodism's, I don't know, desire to, as I say in the piece, engineer worship, sort of, manipulates feelings, that kind of thing. So I've always had those frustrations, but I didn't leave angry. I left at peace with myself. I'm actually married to a United Methodist clergy person. I will still participate in Sunday mornings at that church. I teach a Sunday school class there. I'm not completely opting out, at least in those kinds of ways. But the draw of the Mass for me, and I've said this, I wrote this on my blog, I mean, the only answer I've really got for why I converted at the end of the day, really, I'm at home in the Mass. I'm at home in a liturgy that assumes that Jesus is just there, and that takes this historic language, the poetry of liturgy, and of course there's all the things about tinkering with it and the revisions to the missal, all that. But that takes this beautiful language and just knows that it, over time, week by week, will do its transformative work. And so this idea of engineering or manipulating is just less of a reality. And so that very long answer really comes down to just being at home in those words, in those actions, in those, in that ritual action. I hope that's helpful. I'm happy to answer anything more.
I think it's very helpful. I think for us to have a context out of which you come, because I'm glad you also shared that you have worked in congregational ministry, and so as you think about some of the points that you shared here this afternoon, what are some of the challenges and opportunities that you see for church leaders in terms of being able to begin to work with the congregation that transforms a mindset, a way of being from, in a sense, giving allegiances to other liturgies to a God-centered liturgy in which you've been sharing with us, a missional liturgy in which you've been sharing with us today?
I think one of the things that comes back to me over and over when I think about working for all those years in a large United Methodist suburban congregation as the paid staff person to pay attention to formation, which in and of itself is a bit of the problem, right? That we've sort of divvied up the responsibilities, that formation is this one thing and youth is this other thing, preaching, all of that. That's maybe part of the problem, but when I think back on those experiences, I'm always struck by how I think we always need to give more credit to the laity than we do, that they're up for hearing this news, for being moved in these ways about life-changing liturgy, about all the things that I talked about, that they're not as resistant as we think that they will be. I mean, I can just think back on very particular things, a Bible study or something having to do with prayer or theme-oriented kinds of learning experiences, and I was always very moved by people's willingness to have their minds enlarged about these things. And I do think sometimes that church leadership doesn't quite always trust that. I wasn't an ordained pastor, so I could maybe take more risks than maybe the senior leadership of the church could, and maybe that's also a distinction worth parsing. But I do think the laity, we don't give them enough credit for being willing to engage this kind of material, these kinds of ideas, to be challenged by their own practices. I mean, in many ways, once you give them the language, then they can see, yeah, I've been enslaved by that addiction of shopping or whatever it is, and they're kind of grateful for, this new space that's been opened up to imagine other ways of being a disciple. So that would be one particular thing that just comes back to me over and over, that we'd never give the laity enough credit for.
You made an interesting comment about giving laity the language. What have you found to be helpful in terms of helping the laity, in a sense, gain and own a language? Maybe that's things that you have done or that you have heard others do in terms of working through some of those complex opportunities.
I think in some ways it comes back down to this idea of paying attention and also cultivating a kind of intentionality. I mean, again, just drawing my experience of working in a particular congregation, spent lots of time in, again, different contexts, studies and prayer groups and Lenten devotional things, whatever the sort of meeting itself might have been about, but helping to give background and context and vocabulary to what the people were experiencing in worship, so that again, just not assuming that just showing up for worship week after week will do the formational work that's necessary. That has to, in some ways, be supplemented by an intentional effort at of explaining, and it's tricky, I mean, worship itself should never be didactic. I don't think a preacher should get a chalkboard out and start, explaining this is what we're going to do and this is why we're doing it. But I think there's a place for that sort of extra liturgical formation to say that, well, this is what we did and this is why we did it and this is why it matters. And so when we do baptize a baby and we make these outrageous promises about how we're going to nurture that child, to think through in a different kind of context, what that really means. So I think that extra liturgical catechesis kind of piece of it, again, not assuming that you can just go Sunday after Sunday and completely get it, just having that supplemented by these intentional efforts at paying attention to practice.
We have a comment by Brian and then a question by Carol. Brian comments that he agrees deeply with trust the laity thing, and he said recently he presented similar material based on Jamie Smith's work to rural Mennonite congregations in the Midwest, and heard folks express appreciation for his willingness to challenge them intellectually and trusting them to be able to do the work. Is there any? Would you like? I'll let you come back, Deborah, and comment on that if you'd like. And then there's the question by Carol: how important is it for the person to come to worship, being prepared to worship, knowing it really is for our benefit, not a necessity to God?
Well, I think that, again, comes back to this idea of mindfulness and not mindlessness. I don't know if Carol is meaning some more systematic kind of preparation or sort of self-preparation, just getting ourselves in the right place. I'm not sure if that's a distinction that's at work here. But I do think that it's important that we come prepared, at least ready to be, again, present and in place. I mean, I think it's absolutely essential. I guess the question is, how do you do that? And what does that look like? What does that preparation look like? Is it completely personal and private? I don't think so. And I imagine it looks different in different kinds of contexts. I mean, I will say, having just gone through...
Go ahead.
Sorry. I was just going to say, from my experience of just converting to Catholicism, I went through a pretty rigorous month-long process of preparation. And I think that's helpful. I mean, a lot of Protestant congregations have the new members classes. That looks very different in different contexts. But I do think that some kind of preparation is it's essential. It's just, what's that going to look like in varying contexts? And Brian's points about trusting the lady, I'm glad to see that affirmed. I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised at all. I'm gratified, and I can absolutely understand how that was the case. So yeah, and it culminated in foot washing.
Yeah.
Good.
Carol does add to her comment where she said, yes, because many times we come and expect someone else to frame us in an attitude of worship.
Right. Yeah, I think that gets back to the idea of, I didn't say this in my remarks too much, but maybe it was sort of implied that we are passive, and that the leaders or the leadership of worship is going to sort of feed us, overwhelm us, kind of give us what they think we need. So yeah, I think the expectation that we go thinking that someone else is going to do all the work, and we're going to be moved, entertained, edified, whatever language we might. So yes, I think we do need to come with that kind of attentiveness, mindfulness, expectation that we have work to do in it. I mean, we all know that liturgy means the work of the people, and that we all have, work to do in that offering of ourselves and our praise and thanksgiving. So I agree, Carol. I think that's a helpful way to clarify that.
When you use the phrase detoxing, what kind of receptivity has that how well have people received that word? Because that's not often something that's associated with worship, or even in terms of practice, they see that as kind of this humanistic thing. And so how have you worked at that in helping congregations to understand that point of detoxing?
Yeah, I think two things are going on. One, it just seems like the wrong kind of word in polite conversation. Because detox has all these associations with very troubled lives, and seems to sort of sully maybe the way we want to talk about worship in terms of beautiful language, that kind of thing. So, I mean, I think there's a little bit of that. Just that it's a startling term when we're talking about liturgy and prayer and all the things we associate with worship. But I also think in the few times that I've talked about this in forums like this, or that people, again, they kind of resonate with it. I mean, partly because we know that word and all that's associated with it from ourselves or people in our lives who do struggle with real addictions, who maybe have been to detox for real. I mean, to rehab, and I mean, I think of Richard Rohr's pretty recent book about sort of making connections between AA and Christian spirituality, and I think so. In my experience, there's a little bit of resistance, maybe, that it's just, oh, that's such a strange word to put up against the beauty of worship. But on the other hand, people are saying, I get that, because I know what it's like to be bound in slavery to something that has taken over my life.
Yeah.
And so
we have some more comments here from Dawn. She says, very few churches in our tradition use written historic resources for the liturgy. What helps a people who are wedded to spontaneous prayer and other liturgical pieces to focus on the Missio Dei that you describe?
I don't think liturgical churches have any kind of monopoly on this. I mean, I think churches of all traditions and persuasions and backgrounds and contexts, who claim the name of Christ, who baptize in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, who worship a crucified and risen Savior. I mean, any church, regardless of high church, low church, high liturgy, no liturgy, I mean, those are the foundational sort of pieces of what it means to be people who enact the mission of God. I think what it might mean, I don't know for sure, but I think what it might mean is, again, more intentionality, not a doing away with spontaneity, but a recognition by church leaders, pastors, that those non-liturgical forms and non-liturgical prayers ought to be very much informed by this notion of the mission of God. That so again, intentionality, paying attention, and I do recognize that it's a challenge, but not an impossible one.
And then I want to make sure we pick up some other comments that are being shared with us. Josh Brockway shares, coming back to the definition of liturgy, it seems worth noting that it is the work of the people, but the creation, reconciliation, and outcome is already done.
Yeah, I think that's right. We're participating in a drama that's a story that's already got the ending, right? We're offering prayer and praise and thanksgiving to a God who's already accomplished this mission of reconciling the world. We live in between the time when that was begun and completely consummated, so we know we're participants in that. We know we're co-creators in that work of healing and reconciliation. But yes, the story's already been told, and we're participating.
Bill shares, knowing the Catholic attitude about the Eucharist, would you say, in regards to your comment, people not wanting to worship, do you think not wanting to worship is more from neglecting the Lord's table or from worldly distractions? Okay.
Yes. I think it's probably both of those things. And the thing about not wanting to worship, meaning not feeling like worship, I think that's probably what Bill's referring to, what I was saying, that we often don't feel like it. And he's asking about the Catholic attitude, how that figures in. I can say that in my experience, Catholics can be as mindless as anyone when it comes to worship, and be going through these repetitive rituals in a very mindless way. There's nothing about liturgical form, this sort of, the high church, we might say, liturgy of Catholicism, that is going to ensure mindfulness. Quite the opposite, I think. So it's a challenge across the board. High church Catholics and high church Protestants to very low church Protestants, that of not feeling like it, not feeling it, not wanting to do it, coming from lots of places, including distractions from the outside, and from neglecting the Lord's table, from not participating in that central act that makes us who we are. If we don't do that, how are we going to know who we are? And maybe that's the Protestant piece of it, right? The infrequency of communion. We don't partake often enough. How are we going to?
Well, and that's you pick up on an interesting conversation that's taking place between Bill and Brian, where they're talking about the need to, in a sense, dine at the table more often. and then within our tradition of even taking that to the love feast, the foot washing, and even moving it beyond our walls all year. So I think that has really hit a chord with some people that are participating in this webinar today.
I love that. I mean, I think this is one of the ways my own imagination about these things is opened up by your tradition. The idea of a love feast, foot washing, these are other foundational practices that absolutely do enact the Missio Dei.
Like to ask a question. One thing about the text that you shared in Revelations is it gives a sense of clarity of kind of like that clarity of we know how the story will end. We don't know necessarily how we're all going to get to the ending of the story. There's that clarity in sense of which scriptures talk about and which we're called to, but we live in such a human condition of wanting to have certainty. And so how does that tension of certainty and versus clarity, or certainty and clarity, how does that impact our Christian formation and our discipleship?
I think Allison's insights that I alluded to, that Jesus is just there. I mean, he uses that term kind of over and over, that we can trust that Jesus is present. Doesn't matter if we can feel it or feel him. I mean, again, I can just draw on some very recent personal experience. I just took the Eucharist for the first time in the Catholic Church at the Easter Vigil, and I kind of wondered and obsessed for months. What's that going to feel like? How's that going to make me feel? Am I going to, what's it going to be like? And at the end of the day, it was a stale wafer and some very strong wine that stayed on my tongue. And it was just those material, visceral realities that I experienced kind of bodily. But Jesus was there. He was just there. And that's the certainty that I have. Again, maybe you're alluding to our just excessive need as modern Western heirs of the Enlightenment for kind of proof or certainty that beyond a shadow of a doubt. We don't have that. We trust that it's just there, no matter what it feels like. Yeah, partly because, as you just said, we know how the story ends. We know where it's all headed, even if we don't know the particulars.
Brian is asking a question. He says, Debra, do you have any concrete pedagogical exercises that help folks in congregations detox or get deprogrammed from secular liturgies?
No, I don't think I have any particular concrete ones. I mean, again, just recalling my experience of working in a church where, this is not just a paper you read, but it's, impacting people's lives and understandings and practices. We talked quite a bit about the American flag and the sanctuary, and that might be one avenue into this way of helping people think about how they're programmed by secular liturgies in ways they have no idea. We didn't march the flag out of the sanctuary or anything. We didn't get that far. But I mean, that's one thing I think of that we can. That's a very particular, powerful symbol of the liturgy of the nation state and our loyalty to it. And you can have that conversation. I mean, you really can. You can have that conversation with veterans. You can have that conversation with people who would identify themselves as deeply patriotic. It matters how you have it, of course. It matters how the issues are raised, but it's possible to begin those conversations. So concrete pedagogical exercises, probably not, but several conversations over time in which those issues about secular liturgies and how we disaffiliate.
Ryan shares a possible resource. Check out the Jesus for President Litany of Resistance found in Jesus for President by Shane Claiborne and Chris Hall. And so maybe some possibilities there. And then Brian comes back with another comment, says, as a brother in Anabaptist serving in a United Methodist parish, I wonder how to begin congregations about the flag, or begin that conversation about the flag in the sanctuary, which I certainly didn't grow up with in the Church of the Brethren.
Very carefully. Yeah. That's what I meant earlier. You can have these conversations, but it matters absolutely how you have them. And sometimes I think you have them by helping people make connections on their own. For example, I think anytime we baptize, we're naming and acting, again, this disaffiliation. And if you can bring that into a sermon, to a baptismal sermon, so that over time people begin, maybe, if you're lucky, to say or to conclude or to maybe somehow intuit that well, maybe that flag is next to the altar is a bad idea. If you can catechize and preach in those kinds of ways, where the connections are made by the people, you have much better chance of having these conversations go well. I mean, you would have right on your side if you just initiated a conversation that said, it's idolatrous to have the flag next to the altar, I'm taking it out. But that probably would not serve you well. And I would tell you, Brian, don't do it. Don't do that in your United Methodist Church. I know you wouldn't do that, but yeah, it's all a matter of how you do it, and most especially, I think, over time, and this takes time, this takes a long time, helping people make those connections themselves, begin to ask the questions themselves. That's the challenge, and that takes patience. That takes so much patience. So good luck with that.
Well, and I think that's, just even that counsel there is really relevant for a number of our Church of the Brethren congregations where there is not as strong as a peace position as what there has been in the past. And so where you have the distinction even between where the pastor is at and where the congregation at can create quite a bit of tension if those conversations are not carefully applied. Debra, is there anything else that you would like to say in wrapping up our time? I see Carol is typing, making another comment. We have just a couple minutes that we want to wrap up, and then invite Anton into our chat so he can give some instructions about continuing education. And also, I just want to remind people that a week from today, same time, same station, we have the second webinar with Debra, and it's Missional Worship and the Lord's Table. And so we look forward to continuing this conversation and in our time with Debra Murphy. And so, Debra, I invite you to just make some closing comments or thoughts that you have.
I would just say thank you again for the opportunity to think through matters that I've thought about for a while and tried to write about a little bit, but to think about them in a different sort of setting and context. And I'm very grateful for the ways that even these comments and questions have kind of, as I said before, opened up my own imagination about other forms of witness and practice that can flesh this out in other ways. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to learn in another context, and I look forward to next week to continuing.
All right. We do want to get Carol's comment in. She says liturgy has been established in the Catholic Church, but for many of us, I wonder how much teaching training is done on the importance of worship. And so I think that's a very thoughtful comment that Carol has. And from your experience, Debra, how would you respond to that comment?
I think it's a good insight, or a good, it's a good question. And I think in many ways the Protestant way, and this is a generalization I realize, has been that worship is, it's where we go and where we're fed by sermons, and the Spirit, meets us there. And it's this very kind of sometimes emotional experience, or sometimes this very moving kind of experience. So why do you need to talk or teach about it so much? It's this very personal thing, right? That worship is where I go to sort of get refueled for the week. It's a very kind of me and Jesus thing kind of deal. I mean, again, a little simplistic, but there has been that. So the idea that we ought to have any kind of systematic reflection on that has been hard, because we've thought it to be a very private kind of matter. And I think once we begin to talk again more about liturgy as the work of a whole people, that it's a social body being formed, then that opens up ways, I think, to talk about the importance of worship that get us beyond personal preference and individual experience. So yeah, the answer to your question, how much has been done? Not enough. Much more needs to be done. Yeah.
Okay. I'll forego the comment by Ryan and Brian, the conversation about Chris Call, and but Enton, we invite you in to share the information regarding the webinar and also the continuing education.
Thanks, Stan, and also thanks, Debra, for.
Thank you, Debra. This was great.
This has been wonderful, and so I've switched now to our wrap-up screen, and all those who are participated today, I invite you to vote on both of the quick short polls. The first is, how helpful was the presentation, the content, and the learning that Debra was able to provide for us today? And the second is, how well did you like this webinar format, this online meeting? And these two pieces of information help us to know how we're doing. As well, for those of you who would like to get continuing education units, the instructions are right there in the middle of the screen, and I will post a live link for you over in the chat box. I caution you that when you click that link, you'll be taken away from our meeting here, but feel free to stay here if you have one last question to ask that in, and Debra and Stan will still be here to be able to continue that conversation. Other than that, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to put them in the chat window or let us know afterwards. And I think that would wrap us up, as long as you all promise to return next week for a continuation of this conversation. Again, Debra, thanks. It's been great, and I'm sure we'll have an easier time with the tech next week now that we have the bugs out. And I'll turn it back to you and Stan if you have any other closing comments.
Well, how does it feel, Debra, to complete your first webinar with us? So.
Very relieved, I must say. Yeah, and again, very grateful for all Enton's help. Yeah, glad to have under my belt.
I had a question here. well, I had a question about leadership in the church, and you mentioned earlier about not trusting the laity. In addition to that, what do you feel are some of the assumptions that leaders make about the laity that, in a sense, that impact ministry in such a way that it serves more as an obstacle rather than enabling the congregation to grow?
I can speak mostly out of my experience in Methodism at this point, which, as you probably know, has an appointment system so that clergy are appointed by their bishops. They serve at the pleasure of their bishop. The tenures of United Methodist clergy tend to be fairly short, 3 to 4 years. So I think in a lot of ways, again, what I sort of empirically, anecdotally observed is church leaders and pastors are often hesitant to do what they really want to do, what they sort of feel a passion to do, out of fear for getting moved, losing their job, so to speak. They can't really lose their job, they get moved to another church, but I think that's always kind of hovering in the background for a lot of clergy who really do have a passion to do interesting, imaginative, creative, faithful things around worship and formation, but that's been a part of it, just job security, for a lack of a better word. And I expect that's the case in other traditions too, and not just for clergy who are appointed from the outside, but for clergy who are brought in and sort of hired, so to speak, by a congregation. I think congregational polity works the same in the same sorts of ways a little bit. You don't want to alienate and find yourself gone. So I think that's part of it. I mean, there's a lot more really that could be said, but that's, I've seen that over and over.
I believe that the average length of stay within a congregation by a pastor in our system is not much longer than what it is for United Methodists in the appointment system, and it may actually in some areas be less. So,
I think that speaks to our the ways we sort of give in to cultural pressures and ideas about not being very patient, not taking the long view, not working over the long haul, wanting sort of instant results, that kind of thing. And I think that's across the board in Protestantism and Catholicism, that we're sort of socialized to want, instant results in all parts of our lives, and if we don't see that even in our church life, we want new leadership kind of thing.
All righty. Well, this has been a very good session, and Debra, again, just thank you so much for coming into our lives and sharing with us, and we really appreciate the wealth of knowledge and also the spirit in which you have shared with us today, and blessings upon your journey as well. And so thank you, and I want to thank everyone that joined us for the webinar today. And Anton, thank you for managing our process and making this a possibility for us to share with the wider church.